Glorious spring morning. Today we'll be looking at something diametrically opposed to what you are looking at here. I want to talk about the World Wide Web. What was designed initially as a decentralized, community-focused technology which would allow people the ability to bypass traditional media, whether it was state-controlled or whether it was corporate-controlled, has now, to a significant degree, become a plaything of the corporate and state sector. So why has this occurred? To a significant degree, we find ourselves in this situation because the platform itself has changed from a community-focused platform to a privately owned platform. And in capitalism, an economic and political ideology based on the creation of profit, private investment for private profit, if there's no regulation of any type in terms of its expansion, what will happen is that you will naturally create duopolies and monopolies. And what we've seen with the World Wide Web is the creation of a handful of corporations which now dominate this media. Unlike other media empires, these media empires work on a global scale, not on a nation state or a specific group, but global. And I could list off the major players quite simply, like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, Google. And the key is that all these platforms are privately owned. And the organisation which owns the platform is then able to determine the focus of that particular platform. For example, the so-called gig economy is nothing new. It is 19th century capitalism in its purest form. A capitalism which existed before the evolution of trade unions and workers' organisations. A platform that existed before regulations came into place to protect workers from exploitation, from the creation of a minimum wage. Obviously around the world there are many societies where there is no minimum wage, and exploitation is the name of the game. But as far as the World Wide Web is concerned, it gave corporations the ability to bypass state legislation which was passed to protect the interests of people, workers in those societies. And the creation of these platforms has led us backwards into the 19th century as far as economic and individual interaction is concerned. And we see the exploitation of the workers which carry out the tasks, the exploitation of the groups and companies, individuals which provide the services, and the exploitation of the customers. So it's three-way exploitation. These are just platforms. They're nothing more, they're nothing less. It's other people which do the work. They do the organisation. They allow an economy to develop which is not bound by any regulation as far as their workers is concerned, as far as their customers is concerned. And although it may seem convenient initially, the reality is that when corporations take over the net, what actually happens is that we lose the ability to be protected. All those struggles over the last 150 years have come to naught as far as the gig economy is concerned. So a decentralised, community-focused, community-owned method of communication and interaction has now become fully corporatised, and you, that's right, you are the product. The customer is the product. It's your personal information which provides them with the material which is required to specifically direct advertising at you, and they're able to sell that advertising space to other private investment for private profit organisations. At the same time, what we are seeing is the manipulation of the World Wide Web by political forces which in themselves promote ideas and concepts which may have been relevant and important in the 18th and 19th century, but are no longer relevant and important. We see through the creation of asocial media, not unsocial media, but asocial media, we see the birth and growth of political and social organisations which pander to people's fears. And we've seen the harnessing of these fears to create political movements which are authoritarian and centralised. At the same time, we've seen the state enter the World Wide Web. Huxley's Brave New World is here with us today. George Orwell's 1984 is here with us today. Because the state has realised, and especially centralised authoritarian states have realised, that they can gather very specific information about the citizens or the people they control. They can actually use the World Wide Web and things like facial recognition technology to keep an eye on people in a very simple way through technology, not having to use other people to carry out those tasks, but actually use the World Wide Web to monitor the activities of their citizens, not only monitor the activities of their citizens, but control the activities of their systems. Initially, the World Wide Web may have been a mechanism by which rebel groups and other groups which were fighting centralised authority were able to communicate and organise. We saw this during the Arab Spring in 2013. But what we now see is that centralised authoritarian states are capable and willing and use the World Wide Web to contain dissent, to single out so-called troublemakers, to know exactly what's happening. All police departments and security groups need to do is monitor the web to see what is happening, when it's happening, and work out methods by which they can actually control that dissent. So a technology which was invented initially to provide decentralised communication between individuals and groups, which to a significant degree was invented as a response to a so-called post-nuclear catastrophe where people could actually interact with each other, has now become a plaything of the corporate world and the state. And we are the product. We voluntarily, for no cost, give our most precious details to corporations and the state. And what we've seen over the last 5 years or so is the state increasingly using the World Wide Web as a mechanism by which to conduct its interaction with its citizens. Whether it's an application for a passport, an application for a social security benefit, an application for car registration, or this or that. Even the most mundane, simple interactions are now channeled through the World Wide Web, and people have been refused or denied the ability to actually interact via another mechanism. For example, we've seen with the bills you receive on a daily basis. Many of these bills can only be paid through the web. Many of these bills cannot be paid by cash or cheque. We've seen everyday interaction which has been reduced to an interaction with a phone, where having disposable income based on a cash economy has disappeared. And it's disappeared because it's good for the platforms which promote themselves as providing a more efficient way of doing business, and it's good for the state because it can keep a track on every interaction that an individual does on the web. So although it may seem convenient at first, the issue is, does the World Wide Web assist us as a society to function? Has it made life easier? Is it worth the personal cost? Is it worth the increased surveillance? Is it worth the increased control? So what can we do about this? Nothing. Or can you do something? Well, the first thing we can do is actually decrease our footprint on the World Wide Web. Use it to our advantage. Don't use it for trivial interactions. Only use it for the most important interactions. Now, I have a number of footprints on the World Wide Web, but most of them are designed in such a way as to promote ideas, not give out information about myself personally. It's the same in your situation. You can give yourself to the World Wide Web, or the interactions you have can be selective, because ultimately privacy is not just a matter of keeping certain information to yourself. It's a matter of personal protection for you and your people around you. Then there's the political dimension. The increasing use of the state of the World Wide Web can be stopped. It can be slowed down by people demanding a different way of interacting, of demanding that they continue not to use the World Wide Web to be involved in transactions with the state. At the same time, we can also look at passing legislation which actually protects people involved in the gig economy from exploitation and protecting individuals. Now, unfortunately, these major privately owned corporations have become so huge, so dominating, and their spread is so global that they attempt to blackmail sovereign nation states and their legislative apparatus regarding legislation. For example, in Australia, when the government wanted to pass some minimal legislation regarding Facebook and the protection of customers, we found that Facebook just closed down its operations in Australia for 24 hours. It didn't take long for the government to change its tune in terms of the legislation which was passed, which was basically almost useless as protecting the individual from exploitation by an organisation like Facebook. At the same time, although they denote themselves as being, friendly as far as opinions are concerned, we have seen lately how these private corporations remove people from access to their platforms if they promote ideas which don't suit that particular platform. It's very simple, it's unilateral, there is no appeal process, and we see this over and over and over again. Now, the other solution is something akin to community radio stations. Community radio stations are owned and managed by the organisations which use them. Community radio stations were initially formed by the Whitlam government to try to bypass the corporate-owned media, especially the Murdoch empire, and today there's over 250 community radio stations around Australia. Some are government supported, some are supported by local communities. There is nothing to stop us creating community-owned and community-controlled platforms on the net, whether it's for economic reasons, whether it's for political reasons, whether it's for personal reasons. Why should we rely on state-controlled websites and privately owned platforms for us to conduct our affairs? Because ultimately, the type of society we have is to a significant degree dependent on our ability to freely exercise our rights to association, to freedom of speech, and the list goes on and on. When duopolies, monopolies, or state-based players control major aspects of technology which allow us to interact with our environment, then we find that we are nothing more than customers. Customers have the right to complain, but customers do not have any right as far as the management of a particular platform and its ideological position and what it provides for people. You can be a cringing, carping, complaining customer, or you can be a concerned, active citizen as far as the World Wide Web is concerned. And unless we become concerned, active citizens with a community focus in terms of trying to create and manage and finance community-based platforms, will continue to be hostages to the corporate-owned web and the state-owned and state-controlled web.